Today we are going to be looking at Amicus Anthology films, and I'm going to try and pick 5 fantastic ones for you. Now, if you're not familiar with the work of Amicus, this was a company that was owned by Max Rosenberg and Milton Subotsky, who were massive horror aficionados. They actually had something to do with one of the early Hammer horror films, and they decided to set up their own production company. Now, what's interesting is they decided to create what we call some portmanteau films. These are very much based on the style of an earlier film from 1945 by Ealing called Dead of Night, which is a British horror classic. A portmanteau is a film, it's got several different stories in it, and there's usually a wraparound to connect them all together. So if you're familiar with modern examples like the ABCs of Death and the VHS series, you might want to check these out. They're not as gruesome or as gory, but they're really interesting morality tales. If you've heard of Amicus before, it might be through some of their other films. So there's The Beast Must Die, which is a really interesting werewolf movie. There's actually a werewolf break about 2/3 of the way through. We have to guess who the werewolf is. That was a trick that was nicked from films like Homicidal by William Castle, who was a great exploitation director. They also made 2 Doctor Who adaptations in the 1960s, starring Peter Cushing at the height of Dalek Mania, but he plays a kind of human version of the Doctor called Doctor Who. And also there is the excellent At the Earth's Core, which is one of their fantastic Doug McClure action movies that they made. I'm not going to include in my list an Amicus anthology called The Monster Club. The reason is this is one of my all-time favourite films, and I'll be incredibly biased towards it, and I would put it at the top. So at number 5 is The House That Dripped Blood from 1970, directed by Peter Duffel. Now, this has a really interesting wraparound story, and the segments on their whole are pretty good. They're actually written by Robert Bloch, who was the author of the original novel Psycho, which was made into an excellent film in 1960 by Alfred Hitchcock. Now, I could talk about all the segments, but you get great appearances from Denholm Elliott in the first story. You get the magnificent team of Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee thrown into the gag bag, and you get a terrific story with John Pertwee, who was a former Doctor Who. And it's really interesting because in the film he plays a modern horror movie star who's complaining that modern horror films aren't that scary anymore. It's a very kind of postmodern idea, and he says that the films of like Boris Karloff and Bela Lugosi are much better than modern horrors, and he does a joke about Dracula. And Christopher Lee, who played Dracula, is also in the film. He says he really likes Dracula, played by Bela Lugosi, not this new fellow. I think that's a really nice touch. And you also get Ingrid Pitt in that story, who kind of reminds me of a kind of young Scarlett Johansson in that role, and it's really good. I won't spoil it, but it's one of the really fun ones, and you even get an appearance from Robert Bloch in the film. At number 4 is From Beyond the Grave, directed by Kevin Connor in 1973. Connor was one of Amicus's best directors. He went on to make some of the Doug McClure action movies and a kind of hit and miss American slasher called Motel Hell, which some of you might enjoy. What's interesting about this film is the excellent wraparound starring Peter Cushing with a thick Yorkshire accent, running an antique shop, and one of his best lines in it for me is "Naughty, shouldn't have done that." The number of times I quote that to my students is unbelievable. Now you know where it comes from if you're watching. And you get some excellent British character actors in this film. So you get David Warner in the first segment. Interesting little fact for you is that Warner was originally to play the role of Freddy Krueger in A Nightmare on Elm Street for Wes Craven, but had to pull out due to scheduling conflicts, and was replaced by, of course, Robert Englund. As well, you get performances by Donald Pleasence, perhaps most famous for playing Ernst Stavro Blofeld in You Only Live Twice, a James Bond film, and Dr. Sam Loomis in the Halloween series of films. And his daughter, Angela Pleasence, is in it as well, who actually appeared in an episode of Doctor Who a couple of years ago. They're brilliant with each other. Diana Dawes turns up in that story as well. Briefly, she was considered to be the British Marilyn Monroe in the kind of late 50s, early 1960s, and she actually showed some real acting talent towards the end of her career. She took on more serious roles. She makes an appearance in the Hammer TV series called The Hammer House of Horrors, which is well worth checking out, in a kind of werewolf episode that I don't want to spoil for you. At number 3 is Asylum, directed by Roy Ward Baker in 1972. I think Asylum perhaps has the best of the wraparound stories for the anthology films. Robert Powell, famous for appearing in Jesus Christ Superstar and The Who's rock opera Tommy, as well as several other terrific films. Stars as our lead, who is I think he's a newly qualified psychiatrist who's come to work at this asylum, and he has to work out who the previous doctor, Dr. Stone, is. So he has to go into the different rooms and meet the people and try and work out which one it is. Definitely no spoilers here. You will be quite surprised who it is in the end, and you get the greatest, in my opinion, laughter, creepiest laughter in cinema at the end, over the end credits. Patrick McGee is awesome. He's fantastic here. My favourite role of his is probably in A Clockwork Orange, playing the author at the beginning and the end of the film. He's famous like, "Try the wine." He's just fantastic in that movie. He's on top for me. You get Herbert Lom thrown in as well. The first story has two very famous British actors from the 60s and 70s. Richard Todd, who I believe was briefly considered for the role of James Bond, is really good in here. Very similar to an actor called Stanley Baker. I think he personally would have made a slightly better James Bond, who appeared in Zulu. And also Sylvia Sims, who's a really underrated British actress, appeared in a terrific film called Victim, written by Basil Durden, starring Dirk Bogart, and also Ice Cold in Alex, which is a classic British war film. There's another terrific appearance from Peter Cushing as well in an episode called The Weird Tailor. Slight spoiler here, but the dummy that comes alive at the end to me looks a bit like Fulton Mackay from the hit TV series Porridge, another actor who was considered for the role of Doctor Who. And also there is a really interesting segment with Charlotte Rampling playing alongside horror kind of icon Britt Ekland, so that's well worth checking out. Coming in at number 2 is Tales from the Crypt, directed by Freddie Francis in 1972. Now, I really like this one. It's based on EC comic stories, which are really popular for a couple of decades beforehand in America. Amicus did another adaptation of their stories called The Vault of Horror, where you get Tom Baker, Kurt Jurgens and Terry Thomas. That's well worth checking out. It just didn't quite make the list because the quality level is quite high on these films. Now, what was interesting about the British film industry at the time, it was really struggling due to economic reasons. So what you would get is a lot of notable, respected British actors would turn up for brief appearances in these films to earn a bit of housekeeping money, really. Sir Ralph Richardson plays the Crypt Keeper, a character you might have be familiar with if you know the TV series or read the original comics. He's really good in this. He's one of Britain's greatest ever actors. You get a really interesting appearance from Ian Hendry, you might recognise from Get Carter and Captain Kronos Vampire Hunter, who I've mentioned on a previous episode. I think you get one of Peter Cushing's best roles in here. Now, people have often argued that he was playing himself. He'd recently lost his wife, I think she was called Emily, and he's playing a character trying to get in contact with his recently deceased wife. It's a bit difficult to watch. Peter Cushing's one of my all-time favourite actors, and he plays Grimsdyke, a bin man, and what I really like about it is a real sense of working class pride. He's just a hard-working, genuine kind of guy that's bullied by all these middle-class people in the local area. That's a really good story. A lot of people like the first story starring Joan Collins, where she's kind of chased around a house by a guy dressed as Father Christmas. I'm not so keen, I'm not a big Joan Collins fan, but this one is well worth checking out. Now let's see what's coming in at number 1. At the top of our list at number 1 is Dr. Terror's House of Horrors, also directed by Freddie Francis from 1965. Now this was the first of the Amicus Anthology films. Features a really strong wraparound where people are on a train in a carriage sat together. You've got Christopher Lee, you've got Peter Cushing, the famous jazz musician and star of the TV show Record Breakers, Roy Castle. Donald Sutherland is in there as well, and the famous 60s DJ Alan Fluff Freeman makes an appearance. What I really like about this story is you get 5 short stories in it instead of 4. Now let's go through some of them. Now there's 2 little stories in this I'm going to focus on in particular. The first is Voodoo, which stars Roy Castle, mainly because he was not only an excellent actor but a trumpet player. I think he replaced Acker Bilk, if I'm not mistaken. I think he'd had a heart attack or something near production, so was replaced at the last minute. And Castle's really interesting. He had a great appearance from the 60s lounge singer Kenny Lynch, who does a brilliant song called Give Me Love. And they end up going to this country where there's voodoo practices. There's an early appearance by the actor Sid Haig, who you might recognise from The Devil's Rejects and Spider Baby in there. Some really interesting things happening. Kenny Lynch has some really interesting one-liners, and there's a real side of the permissive society and liberalism, because I think it's Roy Castle says to Kenny Lynch, "Oh, you West Indians really got the vibes, man," or something, and Kenny Lynch says, "No, I was born in the West End of London, mate," and he's great in it. I love that scene. There's also a story starring Alan Freeman called Creeping Vine, which is where this vine plant starts to swallow this whole house. What I find really funny in it is there's an appearance by Bernard Lee, who appeared in James Bond films as M. He's pretty much playing his character of M. His office looks exactly the same, and he's a botanist in it. And they try and cut down these vines, and they somehow manage to throw the shears out the way. It sounds absolutely ludicrous, but if you find it ludicrous, it's ludicrous fun and well worth checking out. And you get Donald Sutherland in a vampire story as well. And Christopher Lee is an interesting film. It's a story that we've seen many times before, the kind of creeping hand, and an appearance from Michael Gough as well, who you might recognise as Alfred in the Tim Burton Batman movies. Now, other Amicus Anthology films are The Vault of Horror, which I mentioned before, Torture Garden, which I'm not a fan of at all, but that's got a bit of critical respect, and The Monster Club, which is just simply awesome. Now, why should you listen to my top 5 Amicus movies? Well, I just want this to be a nice introduction, and I strongly suggest that you watch all of them and meet your friends down the pub or for a coffee and compile your own top 5 Amicus movies, okay? Thank you very much for watching. I've really enjoyed this episode.